Welcome! In this video of Coolgrad video series, we are going to discuss how to write a fabulous recommendation letter. This video is important for people who are recommendation letter providers and also for people who are getting a recommendation letter in order to apply to a university. So in this video, we're going to talk about the format of a recommendation letter, why it is so important, and how important it is in an application process. You might be surprised to know that I've seen quite a few candidates being rejected by universities just because their recommendation letters were screwed up. So let's take a quick look at how to get a fabulous recommendation letter. So what is a Reco letter? So the short form of recommendation letter is a Reco letter, or at least that's what it's called in India. So we're going to talk about Reco letters throughout this video. So a Reco letter must list out your outstanding qualities as a researcher, a student, and a potential faculty member or a great employee. So it should be a one-page document, usually not more than 2 pages, that lists out your academic background, the projects you've worked on, the research you've performed, and your qualities as a team player, as an asset to a university or an organization. So in most of the application packages to universities abroad, you would require at least 3 recommendation letters. Some universities accept 2, but you need at least 3 really good recommendation letters from your lecturers or your employers. So if you are an undergrad kid who's just completed your undergrad and you're applying to universities, then of course you've got to get recommendation letters from your undergraduate professors. But if you have a few years of work experience, you can still get 1 or 2 recommendation letters from your lecturers in the college and 1 or 2 recommendation letters from your boss, from your employer. So, but even if you have many years of work experience and it's been a long time since you went to school, it would still be helpful if someone from an academic background can give you a recommendation letter. Because if you are applying to a university, they would like to see someone who can assess your skills as a student and a researcher to give you a recommendation letter. So what is the format of a recommendation letter? It usually must be around 1 page long, usually not more than a page long, on an A4 size paper or a standard Word document, and it must be usually written using 11 or 12 sized font, and it must always be on the letterhead of the institution. So if it's your undergraduate institution, it must be on the letterhead of your college. If it is from your employer, it must be on the letterhead of the company. So the recommender must write his name, his designation and date at the right side, top right of the recommendation letter. And the recommender must provide his contact details, his email, his phone number, some way in which the university can contact this person to ask for clarifications in case they want to. They should be able to reach out to this person privately and ask them, did you really write this recommendation letter? Do you really know this person? Or if they have any other questions about the candidate, they must be able to get clarifications from the recommender. And the recommendation letter must be addressed to whomsoever it may concern. Or if it is specifically to the university for admission, it can be written as, directed towards the admissions committee. So you say to the admissions committee, and the subject will be recommendation letter for this particular candidate. So the opening sentence of a recommendation letter must be always a warm introduction. The faculty member must write an introduction saying, I know this student for quite a few years now, at least say 1 or 2 years, and it gives me great pleasure to write this recommendation letter to recommend the student to this particular program at this particular university. The professor must mention which courses you have studied under him and what research you have done under him or what projects you implemented. A recommendation letter must be provided by a person who has actually worked with you and not just someone who knows you socially. So, recommendation letters must emphasize your academic projects, how you performed, how you gelled well with the team, and how you got any awards or recognitions for the project, and your research. Remember, universities always look for candidates who have a trend and interest in research because that's what academics is all about, research and publications. So the recommendation letter must talk about your strengths, your abilities, your talents, your all-round personality assessment, and your leadership qualities, how you stepped up and saved some situations, and your organization skills, how meticulous you are, how detail-oriented, how punctual. Those things are certainly good to have on a recommendation letter. It must talk about your professional accomplishments, and most importantly, it must also talk about your potential as a future researcher, because that's what universities are looking for. So a recommendation letter must always talk positive about a candidate. It's never good to write, like an assessment of a candidate where you say these are his plus points and these are his minus points. A recommendation letter must always say really positive, great things about a candidate if it's supposed to work in the candidate's favor. It's better not to have a recommendation at all, letter at all, than to have a lukewarm recommendation letter, which doesn't really impress the admissions committee. So keep that in mind. So recommendation letters can talk about extracurricular activities as long as they're really relevant to the position you're applying for, and as long as they really add value to your acceptance at the university. So if you've won awards like in public speaking, in entrepreneurship, in intercollegiate competitions, by taking on some social responsibility, then it's definitely something that can be mentioned in the Reco letter. For example, if you've created a very popular and useful blog that is read by thousands of people in the world, then that is something they can mention in the recommendation letter. If you've organized a blood drive in your college, that's something that talks about your outstanding leadership skills, your cause, your commitment to social welfare, and of course your potential as a leader and a dynamic scholar. So especially if you're applying for like an MBA, you talk about some event that you organize in your college. It demonstrates that you can manage a team of people, and that is something they would love to see in a recommendation letter, especially for management positions, and it wouldn't hurt to have them for other positions as well. Suppose you have won a hackathon, that definitely would be a feather in your cap if you're applying to a technical position, and not to mention any other position as well. So recommendation letters must always be 100% positive. If you are a lecturer who is going to provide a recommendation letter to a student, I encourage you not to become too emotional or personal in assessing the student's personality. For example, you don't talk about irrelevant details such as the personality of the student, which doesn't be relevant to the application. You don't talk about how warm and nice and honest. Honesty is a good thing to write about. You don't talk about how friendly a person is, how nice he or she looks, and what his family problems are. You don't talk about how kind he is and how he helped you in your family problems, or how he helped you when you fell sick. That's not something. How nice a person is not a factor that's relevant in providing admission to a person. You assess his potential as a good student and a researcher and a scholar and give admission. If he's good, that's okay, but that's not really going to add value in the recommendation letter. It's just going to be like a waste of real estate space. And also, the admissions committee would think that the recommender was kind of immature and inexperienced if he gets too emotional in writing such irrelevant details in the recommendation letter. So, if a lecturer says anything that's mediocre or average about you, it's actually going to weigh your application down terribly. If you don't have an outstanding recommendation letter, you don't have to settle for a mediocre one. You have to submit 3 recommendation letters, and you can ask various people, but if you submit a recommendation letter that just talks about you as, yet another candidate, just another player, nothing really great about you, it's going to weigh your application down. You better submit only 2 recommendation letters if you can't find 3, and try and see if that works, instead of submitting a mediocre or lukewarm recommendation letter. Please keep that in mind. If you don't have great recommendation letters, it's better not to have one at all than to submit a lukewarm recommendation letter. In some European and Asian countries, recommendation letters provide a realistic assessment of a candidate's strengths and weaknesses. But in American culture, universities and jobs expect recommendation letters to be always 100% positive and strong in referring the candidate. We don't assess a person with an impersonal outlook saying, hey, these are his strengths, these are his weaknesses, take him or leave him. A recommender, especially while applying to universities in America, must keep in mind that he must always write an outstanding and 100% positive recommendation letter. That's what they look for. Otherwise, you're actually impeding the candidate's prospects. Of course, all of us have plus and minus points, but you don't have to highlight the minus points in a recommendation letter if you want to help the candidate. How to submit Reco letters. So remember, the recommendation letter must be signed by the provider. The professor or the employer must remember to sign the recommendation letter, whether it's electronic signature or a physical copy. It must always be signed with date, and he must provide his contact details too. And most universities expect recommendation letters to be submitted online in the application package. So they can log on to you give them a link from your application and they can submit their recommendation letter directly onto the website. You don't have to mail them a physical copy. But if you can't do it online, if they give you a hard copy, you can always scan it and put it up there. So that's usually the way it works these days. But some universities still do accept hard copies. Like you mail them a physical copy of your transcripts and your recommendation letter and your statement of purpose. They do accept, hard copy of, paper documents, especially from countries where maybe the internet facilities are not very good or something like that. So, if a professor is submitting a recommendation letter online, he can directly type the content in a Word document and then copy and paste it on the university website. It's not good to type it on the university site, but type it like in a PDF document and make it into a Word document or a PDF document and upload it onto the application. That's usually a way to save time. And many universities these days insist on direct online recommendation letters. So whom to ask for recommendation letters? You got to ask people who can assess you from an academic standpoint or from a manager's standpoint. Either you ask your employers, your boss whom you have worked with in close proximity, or you ask your lecturers whose courses you have taken, or under whom you perform research or projects. It's not about people who hold top positions, okay? So you don't have to talk to the CEO or vice president of your company and submit recommendation letters from them, assuming it looks really good on your application package. If they don't know you personally, and if the admissions committee comes to know that they just gave you a recommendation letter because they know you, through somebody else or socially, but they weren't really qualified to assess your work, then it's actually going to weigh your application down. You have to try and get recommendation letters from more senior lecturers if you have taken their courses or worked with them, as opposed to a junior lecturer, because their words carry more weightage in the academic world, and also because they are more respected and reputed in the world. And it certainly helps to have recommendation letters from more famous people. So whom not to get recos from? So don't approach people who have fancy titles like the principal of your college, or the head of the department of your college, or the CEO, vice president of your company, if you have not worked with them closely enough. It's actually going to work against you. It's not going to work in your favor. So keep that in mind. Get it from people who are slightly senior, only under whom you have worked, taken at least a course, or directly worked under, because that's what will add weightage to your application. So definitely don't ask for recommendation letters from your relatives and friends. And there was a case where a candidate actually submitted a recommendation letter from her boyfriend because she thought he could assess her personality very well. But he wasn't qualified enough to assess her work, her academic performance, or her performance at the workplace. So don't ask for recommendation letters from your uncles, aunts, relatives, or your husband or children, whoever, regardless of how famous they are. Only if they know you, socially. They need to know you professionally. I have an uncle who's a really famous professor, at a top-notch Ivy League university. And when I was applying to grad school, I in fact approached him because I thought, hey, it looks cool to have a recommendation letter from, this famous uncle of mine. But he clearly told me, I know you only socially, I don't know you professionally, or I can't assess your academic skills, regardless of how brilliant a student you might be. And that didn't work out. And I was very young at the time, but now I know better. You shouldn't even be approaching people who you haven't worked for. So keep that in mind. And if you have ever had an argument with a professor, a nasty, bitter argument or a fallout, and if you're not on good terms with that person, you better not get a recommendation letter from that person. Even if they give you a good recommendation letter in writing, if the university calls them up to ask for further clarifications or questions, they might actually say something bad about you. Or if you've failed in a particular course under a professor, or if you've scored poorly even once, or you got caught cheating even once, please don't get recommendation letters from such people. Because in the first place, they're probably not going to give you a recommendation letter. And if they do give you one, they might give you a lukewarm recommendation letter. Or, just to save face, they might give you a really nice recommendation letter. But if they know someone at the university, or if the university calls them up, they're going to say bad things about you in all probability. So keep that in mind. So do people always give good recommendation letters? You ask, 3 people and they agree to give you recommendation letters, but are they always going to give you good recommendation letters? No. Unfortunately, no. There have been a lot of instances where candidates lost out on university admissions because the professors gave them lukewarm or even bad recommendation letters. So, sometimes you have to sign a waiver form that prevents you from reviewing what the professor submitted to the future university. So the professor might have written whatever he wants, but they ask for a waiver, so you can't see what they wrote. And you don't know, so you have to have complete trust in each other. So sometimes there have been students who had arguments with the professors, who didn't do well in the research project, or who were charged with academic dishonesty. And when they had to apply to other universities, either to transfer from a PhD program or a master's program, or to continue their education, or to get a job, these professors really screwed up their recommendation letters, and they made sure they would never get admission anywhere. So you have to get recommendation letters only from people whom you can trust, who are really willing to give you an outstanding recommendation letter. So keep that in mind. This is a very important component of an application. So when to request recommendation letters? So you have to request for recommendation letters at least 2 months before the deadline of the application. So if the deadline is in October, so you have to ask them like maybe in June or July or latest by August. Don't expect your professors or employers to drop everything and give you a recommendation letter at the last minute. So if you give them just 1 or 2 weeks time, they're probably going to flatly refuse to give you a recommendation letter. Or maybe they would, give you a lukewarm recommendation letter. Or, a lot of people just ask you to, approach somebody else. You have to give them enough time to think and write a recommendation letter, at least 2 months' time. And in between, you make sure you don't pester them, okay? So just remind them politely by emails and phone calls, maybe once or twice, saying, hey, how's it going? Are you writing the recommendation letter? Are you ready to submit? Is there anything I can do to help you expedite the process? But don't make a nuisance of yourself, okay? So you need to give them enough time to plan and write a well thought out recommendation letter. How to request recommendation letter? Write an email to the professor or verbally request them to write a good recommendation letter. But even if you've had a verbal agreement that he's going to give you a recommendation letter, it always has to be backed up by an email or some written communication in which he agrees to give you a recommendation letter so that you can question them about it later. If you've just had a verbal agreement, he might just forget about it, you never know. It's important to get it in writing that this professor is ready to give you a recommendation letter. So when you ask them verbally first, and then ask them, follow up with an email to confirm that they're going to give you the recommendation letter. So when you tell them you want a recommendation letter, you can remind them of the time you were the topper of the class, remind them of the courses you took under them, remind them of all the work you did and the awards you won, just to refresh their memory. But you have no control over what they write in the recommendation letter. Ultimately, they're going to write whatever they want to write, but you can always remind them, hey, remember, I took this course, I got this, and I got this excellent grade, and I was the topper. Our team won the first prize in this competition. So, can you give me a recommendation letter? It's okay to remind them, because they might have forgotten some details. So build trust and rapport with your current professors. So remember, when you leave the university, you need at least 3 of them to be able to give you recommendation letters. So if you haven't had a time to make an impression, or you haven't made the effort to make an impression on at least 3 professors, take the time and do it. It's mandatory, it's worth it. Because your employers, your future university admissions committee, they all need recommendations. It works on recommendations. So make the time to visit them during their office hours, to ask them right questions in the class, make an impression, make them remember you and give you a good recommendation letter. So there is a narrow line between being persistent and annoying. So don't annoy them, but it's okay to be persistent. How to submit recommendation letters? So they can be submitted online, and if they are ready to accept a paper copy, you can also mail it in. Remember to write your student ID or reference number at the top right of the recommendation letter of the envelope if mailing it. So if you are logging in and submitting your application online, it will show you whether the recommendation provider has submitted the recommendation letter or not. And if they've submitted it, there's no way you can go and put in the student ID on top of it. But if it's all tied up to your student account on the university, then automatically the recommendation letters will be in that account. And also remember, if you're submitting a hard copy, write your student ID at the top right of the recommendation letter, or if it is sealed, remember you have to seal the recommendation letter, put it in an envelope and get them to seal, get the recommendation provider to seal, to have their signature on the flap at the back of the envelope. That's actually mandatory for most universities. So when they write it and put it in an envelope, they got to seal it and sign on the back of it across the flap. So sometimes professors ask for a waiver, so you won't be able to see what they wrote. It doesn't mean that they're going to give you a bad recommendation letter. It just means that they do it as a policy sometimes. So if they ask you to sign a waiver, you have no choice but to sign a waiver if you want the recommendation letter. Unless you truly trust the professor, don't agree to sign a waiver and get a recommendation letter from them. Remember, one bad recommendation letter or one lukewarm recommendation letter can weigh your application down tremendously. So, talk to your seniors and other students at the university, talk to your colleagues and see what kind of a person is this employer, or what kind of a person is this professor. So only if he has not screwed up other people's recommendation letters, if he has a reputation of not being cranky or cruel, and if he hasn't harmed any people in the past, then maybe it's okay to trust them and sign a waiver to get a recommendation letter from them. Most people don't ask for waivers usually, but it's okay. It's nothing to be alarmed about if somebody asks you for a waiver. So don't throw your weight around. So if you are looking only for really famous people to give you recommendation letters, and if you're just trying to impress the admissions committee by saying, hey, look, I got these top really famous people to refer me, but if they're not really qualified to assess you, it's going to weigh your application down. So if you're applying to a particular university and your uncle, aunt, cousin, somebody was an alumnus of that university, someone who graduated from that university previously, I mean, if somebody mentions it, or if you're writing a recommendation letter for yourself. I've heard this happen in some countries where students write their own recommendation letters and they just get the lecturer to sign it, and the lecturer sometimes reviews it, sometimes doesn't. They just write their own recommendation letters and sign it, and a lot of undergrad kids and even grad students, they don't have the maturity of a faculty member. And the admissions committee can easily see that it was written by the student himself. and it's actually going to weigh your prospects down. So, how to ensure you get good recommendation letters? So maintain the relationship with your professors and your managers. It's not worth getting in arguments with them. It's not worth having fallouts with them. So never gossip about them behind their back. So I know cases where like a professor screwed up a student's recommendation letter simply because he got to know that the student was bad-mouthing this professor, was gossiping and, saying nasty things about this professor behind his back. He got to know it, he said nothing about it to the student, he agreed to give him a good recommendation letter, but then got a waiver and actually gave him a bad recommendation letter. Professors can be vengeful too. After all, they're human. This happens. Sometimes it does happen. It has happened and it will happen in future. So express gratitude to your professors now and then, especially your advisor. Take them some gifts. You don't have to flatter them, but be on good terms with them. When you commit to do something, honor your commitments and maintain your relationship with them. So in your project reports and your thesis, always thank your sponsors, thank your advisor, thank the lecturers who've helped you in the very front portion of your report. I've known cases where there was a professor who offered funding to a PhD student in aerospace engineering, and the student did a lukewarm job on the project. So this professor was still ready to give him a good recommendation letter for his postdoctoral application, but when he saw the thesis report of this PhD student, there was not even a mention of thanks anywhere on this entire thesis report. And the professor was really mad because he funded this guy, paid him like $2,000 a month for 5 years, and there was no mention of the sponsor. And when he asked for a recommendation letter, he actually wrote something bad in the recommendation letter. Not necessarily that he didn't offer him gratitude, but he wrote something lukewarm, something that would actually, harm the prospects of this candidate. It's that serious. You got to put in effort to maintain relationship with your professors if you want a good recommendation letter from them. A simple act of ingratitude actually might be, held in your professor's mind for quite a while, or your boss's mind, and they might actually take it out in the recommendation letter. So, how people screw up recommendation letters. So, there was one instance where there was a PhD student in a top university, and due to some reason, his funding was terminated for that project because either the university was starved of funds, or that project didn't do very well, or the student was incompetent. I don't know why, but they lost funding, and he had 3 advisors in his PhD program, and they said they couldn't support him anymore. If you want to continue the PhD, you got to do it by paying for it yourself. So this guy had to drop his PhD program in between, and he decided to transfer to another university where he could continue and finish his PhD program. So he transferred, and he applied to 11 of the best universities in that field. And these 3 advisors, he approached them for recommendation letters, and they all took waivers, so he didn't know what they wrote. And then he was really shocked, that he didn't get admission in any of the 11 universities where he applied. And sometimes you can ask these universities' admissions committee as to why you didn't get admission, and they would tell you it's because some university told him that's because one of the recommendation letters was bad. That's the reason they rejected him. So if the recommendation letter was bad at one university, it's possible that it was bad at all the 11 universities, and that's probably why they rejected him. And so he was in a really tight spot now. You can't just walk up to the advisors and ask them, hey, did you screw up my recommendation letter? Well, they might deny it, they might not entertain you. You can't demand them, you can't question what they wrote. And the worst part is, of the 3 advisors, he didn't know who had screwed up his recommendation letter. So he had already invested 2 or 3 years in the PhD program, and it all came to naught. Because they made sure he would not get admission in any of the top universities in that discipline. So he had to either take a job somewhere else or start a PhD all over again somewhere. But even for that, he would need recommendation letters. And out of these 3 advisors who supervised his work, he doesn't know which one screwed up his recommendation letter. So even for future applications, he would need 3 recommendation letters. So if he went to 3 entirely different professors who didn't supervise his work, who were not his advisors, they would ask the candidate, like, why didn't you get them from your advisors? And you can't make up excuses for not getting recommendation letters from all the 3 advisors. So you have to get it from at least one of them, right? And he didn't know which one screwed up his recommendation letter. So basically they made sure his prospects were completely screwed up. It's not worth getting into fights with your advisors and your professors. Put in effort to maintain relationships. So this is one instance I know of a student whose life was screwed up just because he got in arguments with, with people at the department, and maybe he was incompetent, I don't know. But for some reason they screwed up his prospects. And there's nothing he can do about it, I guess. So now we're going to review some sample recommendation letters before we wrap up this video. So I'm going to show you a sample recommendation letter that one of professors had written for a student. So in this recommendation letter, you will see, this was actually given to me by one of my professors in my university. So this professor wrote she was a professor of marketing at the University of Arizona, and she had put the date, and she gave her contact details, and she said to whomever it may concern. I was actually applying for a PhD program in entrepreneurship at one point of time, a few years back, and she was recommending me to the PhD program in marketing, and it's actually in entrepreneurship. So she writes a letter in support of my application for doctoral studies, and she said she's known me for approximately 18 months, and that I was a student in her particular course, and that I impressed her as a very diligent, committed young woman. I earned an A in the course, and I was a member of the best group project of the year, possibly the best in 5 years. Hey, now that's something they would like to hear. And so they described the project, and she says, I was more than a member of the fantastic group project team. I was a great contributor in my own right. So when the course began, I talked about how some examples were particularly related to American culture, and being an Indian, I couldn't relate to it very well, but I met her in the office hours, and then those concerns, melted away. So she says I was inquisitive and persistent and unrelenting in my search for course content and for so many answers. I did fabulous research. She writes a lot of nice things, and she says she's not surprised that I'm applying for doctoral studies. So she says she's phenomenal, and she's applying for a PhD program, and she says you can call me, and she strongly recommends me to the doctoral program. So this is usually the way a recommendation letter is written, and in the end she even put her signature and put her designation. So this is how you write a recommendation letter. So those of you who are getting recommendation letters, please make sure you don't write them yourself. Get them from someone who has the maturity to write a really good recommendation letter. And now we've talked about the format, how to request, when to request, what to write, what not to write, and how to make it fabulous. So good luck in getting recommendation letters, and good luck in your applications at university, and I hope you get into the best universities. Thank you.